Question number 8. Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister responsible for the Earthquake Commission. What is the total number of complaints lodged with EQC in relation to the Canterbury Home Repair Programme to date?
The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, very few, although over the 5 years, possibly a few more than the number of signatures on a petition on this matter being presented to Andrew Little tomorrow by the Christchurch Central Labor Party candidate Dr Duncan Webb.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order.
That was a primary question on notice. I asked the Minister how many complaints had been lodged to date. That is a number answer that could be given.
I would have thought, that a better answer could be given as to the number to answer very few, given the time the Minister's had to prepare the answer. Is the Honourable Jerry Brownlee going to add to his answer?
A point of order, Mr Speaker. I was simply pointing out that sometimes there's more to a question in the House than meets the eye. But I'm happy to answer the question.
That's not actually a helpful point of order. The question's on notice. The question asked for the number of complaints that have been lodged. I would have hoped the Minister's had time to prepare an answer to give that. Honourable Jerry.
Mr Speaker.
Order.
Well, if he's going to finish, I'll let him finish.
Which will we have first? We'll have the answer then. The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, 4,900 out of 167,000 in 2011, 7,312 out of 167,000 in 2012, 5,612 out of 167,000 in 2013, 3,954 out of 167,000 in 2014, 2,525 in 2015 out of 167,000, and 525 to date this year out of 167,000 claims.
Point of order. Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I'd like you and the Ministers, in fact, to reflect on when a question is put on notice, as Megan Woods has put something on notice, and the Ministers clearly have that information, as we've just demonstrated Mr Brownlee does, whether it's reasonable to expect that they will give that information rather than giving a dismissive answer and then insulting the questioner.
Order. Well, I think I've addressed that matter already, in that the point was raised immediately by the questioner, and quite legitimately so. I said that I didn't think the answer was satisfactory. The Minister's now given that. I'd certainly appreciate if Ministers gave the information in the first place. But how they choose to answer the question is, in the first instance, their responsibility. I can only move to tidy it up once I've heard the answer. I can't anticipate an answer to a question. Further supplementary?
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Dr Megan Woods.
Does he think it is acceptable that sales of properties are falling through due to dodgy foundation repairs, and those stranded homeowners are being told by EQC that they will have to wait months for an appropriate team to review the issue?
The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, the member seeks an answer to what is, by the way it's presented, quite a hypothetical situation. What I can say is that we take, that is the EQC, takes remedial repairs where they're required very seriously, but they are not large in number, given that there have been 167,000 built property claims in Christchurch. There are always reasons why properties that are in the process of being sold do not progress to a sale for one reason or another.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, Dr Megan.
I seek leave to table a file note from my office of a case where a sale of a property has fallen through this week because it failed a home inspection on a foundation repair by EQC.
Order.
Leave to file to the file.
Order. I'll put the leave, and the House can decide. Leave us to table that particular file note. Is there any objection? There is none.
Point of order.
Point of order, Dr Megan Woods.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table an email from EQC telling that same homeowner that they will have to wait months for a team to assess their issue.
Leave us to table that particular email. Is there any objection? There is none. Can be tabled.
Thank you. Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Dr Megan Woods.
How many more remedial requests does EQC expect to receive, and how long will those claimants have to wait?
The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, I think the first point I would like to make is that EQC is receiving those complaints and is acting upon them. There is one of the reasons why we progressed to the managed repair program was so that people would have somewhere to go when these circumstances arose. The numbers out of 167,000 claims are small. We would hope, Mr Speaker, to get to all of those people as quickly as possible. But there is no standing army outside of the CHIRT program, and as the 900 or so houses that are left in that program are concluded, then work will progress on those other matters.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Dr Megan Woods.
Does he think it is acceptable that EQC did not front up and tell the public the real reason that thousands of drain repairs in Canterbury had to be reassessed was because the initial inspections were of, quote, variable quality, or is that just code for dodgy?
The Honourable
Mr Speaker, the member over there repeatedly uses words like that to try and discredit EQC. What she forgets is that this has been a long seismic event. 13,000 earthquakes, 67 over 5 on the Richter scale. An assessment done at the start of that process would be very different done at the end of it. If the member can't work that out, I suggest that she's a dodgy member and shouldn't be in the House.
Order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order. I'm going to ask the member to withdraw the last comment about the member.
I withdraw. She's certainly got every right to be in the House.
Order. No. We're just going to have the
withdraw the
withdrawal of
full
the word, the epithet.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I asked the Minister a pretty straight question. I asked him if he thought it was acceptable. He got too caught up in his insults to answer.
No, the member was very lucky that I allowed the question to stand. It was a question full of innuendo. The Minister certainly addressed it in light of the way the question was done. Chris Hipkins, question.
Mr Speaker, there have been instances where members on this side of the House have been asked to withdraw and apologise and have faced a much more serious reprimand for adding additional comments at the end of that.
Order.
And we've seen
Order. That's getting very dangerous to being a criticism of the Speaker. I determine the remedy I'll take. I determine whether I'll be asking for a withdrawal. I determine whether it's a withdrawal and apology, or I may even ask the member to leave the House. On this occasion, when the word was used by the member herself in answering the question, I took the action I did. And I'm quite comfortable with the action that I took, and I don't expect to be then criticised by Chris Hipkins for it.
Supplementary
question, Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you. When there are tens of thousands of complaints, not just a few, when people are blocked from selling their houses and can't move on with their lives because of botched repairs, and EQC refuses to front up with the facts, will he finally admit that things are a mess and undertake an independent inquiry into EQC?
And before I call the Minister, if it's a political answer that's given, that would be perfectly acceptable in light of the question that was asked. The Honourable Jerry Brown.
Thank you. Mr Speaker, I'm above that sort of thing, as you know. So I will give a straight answer. The member will be deeply disappointed to know that her claims of tens of thousands of complaints, etc., tens of thousands of complaints, leave us now because EQC deals with those complaints, because EQC is a place to go if you've got those complaints. There are only 700 or so complaints currently open, many of those in a state of being repaired. The member is trying to make menace where it doesn't exist in order to promote the opportunities for Dr Duncan Webb, the Labor Party candidate for Christchurch Central.
We don't need to go that far. Question number 9.